Hi, everyone. So it's about to be the 100th anniversary of the birth of Pierre Boulez on March 26th, 2025. And that is a momentous occasion. And this has been actually quite a long time coming, but I thought I should do a video summarizing some of my thoughts about Boulez, the impact that he's had, and my own personal experiences with him. So the reason this has been a long time coming is that, quite frankly, it's taken me a very long time to sort out my feelings about Boulez. And not that I've come to any definitive conclusions, far from it, but I'm at a point now where I can at least say some provisional things about where I might stand relative to his work, and also share some personal recollections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my personal experiences encountering not only Boulez the man, but also his work when I was quite young. I'm going to talk about the work itself, what my current thoughts are about it. I'm going to talk about Boulez the conductor and the public figure. And then we're going to discuss what I think the state of his legacy is today. And of course, with all of this, I would really like this to be a discussion. I know Boulez is a figure that inspires a lot of extreme reactions for and against, and I would really love it if you would let me know in the comments section what you think. If you agree with me, disagree, if you have some recollections you'd like to share, I would love that. Okay, so let's start with the personal recollections. So I'm going to start with my first encounters with Boulez's music, which occurred rather early on, I would say. I was probably about 18 when I first encountered his music, and I think the first piece I heard was probably Le Marteau sans Maître. Not surprisingly, that's the piece that a lot of people hear when they first come to his music. And that happened because I was studying composition privately with a teacher who was at the Glen Gould School in Toronto at the time. And he was surprised to learn that I'd never heard this piece and had an LP recording of it, which he lent to me. And I took it home and listened to this work and was dumbfounded. I was completely entranced by it. The thing that really struck me with Le Marteau sans Maître was how accessible it seemed to me at that time. And that's a word I use with some trepidation because it's not exactly it's not a toe tapper exactly. But there was something about the immediacy of expression in that piece, the color, the strangeness of that world that you just plunge right into from the very first seconds of the piece, that was immediately striking. And it's a piece that I didn't feel like I needed to understand technically what he was up to, how the piece was put together. I didn't need to read the poems 100 times to sort of understand that. I understood it viscerally because the expressive world of that piece is just so striking. It's so unique. There's really nothing else that sounds like it. And I didn't need to hear the piece 10 times. It was clear from the first seconds of the first movement of the piece. So that really struck me. And I was reading a lot about contemporary music, modern music, notably in Paul Griffith's amazing book on the subject. And of course, that led me to all of the early scores, the 3 piano sonatas, the sonatine for flute and piano, Le Soleil des Eaux, Le Visage Nuptial, and all of these wonderful early scores. And I remember I had to order a copy of the second sonata. I had to actually buy it because it wasn't available any other way in Toronto at the time, at least not that I could determine. And it was an expensive score, and it took weeks for it to come in at the library of the Royal Conservatory of Music, where I was studying. And there again, total fascination. I thought, this is just incredible. I've never seen anything like this. This is music of such volcanic intensity. The expression of it, you can be for it or against it, but it's palpable. It's strong. It's a piece that just grabs you by the lapels and gives you a good shaking and doesn't let go. And that was very appealing. Again, I wasn't terribly preoccupied with the technical dimension of that piece, exactly how he did it. I didn't really care. It was just like, this is totally incredible. And that experience repeated itself, with all of those pieces. Then eventually I gravitated towards the more recent pieces, the works that, recent, relatively speaking. Let's say the works that Boulez composed after Éclat multiple, which is around 1964. Starting with Sur Incise. So I went to a CD shop, which existed in Toronto at the time. I think they've now closed, called L'Atelier Grégorien. Some of you might remember this store. It was actually really a nice place to go to buy classical CDs in the 90s and early 2000s. And I got a copy of Sur Incise, which was bundled with Message Esquisse and En Thème 2. And listened to that piece, and, you know, I was well disposed towards it and curious to hear it, of course, but it didn't really provoke the same reaction in me. I wasn't quite as interested in it. And I had the occasion to hear a number of Boulez pieces live when Boulez came to Toronto to receive the prestigious Glenn Gould Award. I don't remember the exact year. This was probably 2001, maybe 2002. I narrowly missed an opportunity to meet him on that occasion. I had a friend who was well connected at the time, who was in contact with Boulez and wanted to introduce me to him after the show, but I was, at that time especially, not particularly comfortable in large gatherings, and, you know, kind of headed home immediately after the show ended. But so that's too bad. I could have met Boulez already at that point. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The concert made a great impression. Jean-Guyen Queyras, the Québécois cellist, was on hand to play the solo part in Message Esquisse, and they played movements from the Improvisation sur Mallarmé and a bunch of other pieces. There was a live performance of the first piano sonata. It was great. I really enjoyed that occasion. In 2003, I moved to Paris, and I remember when I made this move, I was sort of mentally calculating, thinking, okay, 2003, Boulez is 78 years old, so, you know, provided things go reasonably well for him, I could have another 10 years of possible, you know, opportunities to encounter Boulez, and made the same calculation with Ligeti and Stockhausen, thinking, you know, here's the age they're at now, and, you know, if I go now to Paris, then there's a chance that, you know, I'll have X number of years. With Stockhausen, of course, unfortunately, although I had the opportunity to go to the Stockhausen courses in Kyoto and meet him, I never did that. I really regret not having done it, because I could have done it in 2004, 2005. And each time I thought, not this year. And of course, in 2006, I believe it was, Stockhausen died unexpectedly. So that's really something I regret. Same with Ligeti. I didn't really realize how ill he was at that point. I don't know that I would have had the opportunity to meet him, but I regret that didn't happen. Anyway, there were a number of these major figures still, you know, some more active than others, obviously, but a lot of them were still around at that point. And I was really excited at the prospect of going to Paris and being able to see them, maybe, you know, hear them perform, or just get a glimpse of them after a concert. I got to see Elliott Carter, for example. That was really exciting, and a bunch of other major figures, Kurtag, Holliger, and others. And relatively early on, I started attending Boulez's concerts at the Cité de la Musique in Paris, and that was just incredible. He played Le Marteau sans Maître. He played works by Varese. I remember this very distinctly, a performance that Boulez gave of Octandre at the Salle Pleyel, back when the Salle Pleyel still had concerts of that sort. They don't anymore. And just countless concerts that I was able to attend. He played Rituel, I remember shortly after Stockhausen's death, actually. And all of those were just incredible experiences. And my oboe teacher at the time, who was the oboist, the sort of solo oboist of the Intercontemporain, Didier Pateau, took me backstage to meet Boulez. And that was the first time I actually sort of laid eyes on him in close quarters, let's say, and had a really nice conversation with him. He was extraordinarily generous, and immediately and spontaneously offered at the end of our discussion to have me attend, you know, any of his rehearsals that I wanted to whenever he was at the Cité de la Musique performing, which I remain grateful to him for until this day. So I had the opportunity to go and hear Boulez rehearse and just see what that process was like. It was totally amazing. The economy of gesture, the generosity also towards his colleagues. I saw him working with many composers, some very young ones, including, and always, you know, just very deferential and not at all this sort of authoritarian figure, although he sort of commanded this incredible respect that was just evident as soon as he entered a room. There was, you know, he was the boss, you know, when he entered a room, but it was something that was just kind of He didn't have to make a big show about it or throw his weight around. It was just kind of, there was this automatic respect that was accorded to him as a kind of a great man of music. So all of those experiences were very positive as far as I was concerned. And that continued for quite a few years. I had many occasions to speak with Boulez, to go and hear him conduct. He attended the premiere of one of my compositions, a piece called Night Division. I don't remember exactly what year that was, but I was just amazing. It was sort of like, an unknown physics student. It turns out that Albert Einstein is attending his thesis defense. It's kind of like, wow, that's pretty incredible. And Boulez was very complimentary and spoke to me after the performance. And what more could you ask for as a young composer, really? And he was very, very supportive of young groups that I was associated with or familiar with at the time, such as Le Balcon, which is now one of the major ensembles in Paris. Always very encouraging. And also when you attended his rehearsals, one of the things you very quickly saw was his insistence on, not on structural things, not on this sort of pedantic, that's supposed to be an F sharp kind of thing for which he's known, but rather an emphasis on the shape of a phrase, on expression, and above all, flexibility. I remember attending a rehearsal of Le Marteau sans Maître, in which he enjoined the solo flutist who was playing the movement for voice and flute, L'artisanat furieux, and he said to her, it has to be freer, it has to be more flexible in the phrasing, and there was, you could have rigor and freedom and flexibility at the same time, and amazing, it was great. I got to hear a conducting masterclass that he gave at the CNSM in Paris. And again, just extraordinarily helpful to all of these young students, giving them very, very pragmatic advice and just very, this is what you need to do in order to get this result. It was very straightforward and totally, from what I could see, totally non-sectarian and just generous and generous with his time. There was one student at the Paris Conservatory, I remember, who was constantly needling Boulez for, really, really specific technical things that he wanted to learn about conducting. And this student was, it could have been a little bit more refined, in terms of how he approached Boulez socially, let's say. Boulez never lost his patience. He was very, very generous to this young man and answered his questions. He made it clear that the conversation would have to be short because he was busy, but he never brushed him off. And, he answered them, and it was very, again, the word that keeps coming to mind, I've probably said this a few times now, is he was generous. So those are all things that I remember from Boulez in my interactions with him. And I'll always be grateful for that. So there are other sides to this, the actual works of Boulez. So I mentioned that I was less than enthusiastic, at least on my initial encounter with pieces like Sur Incise. That was a bit of a disappointment for me, if I'm totally frank about it. And my evaluation of those late works has oscillated over the years. There have been times when I've really appreciated them. There have been times when I found them impossible to listen to. Where I've sort of landed on this question, and this is kind of interesting because this is the opposite of where a lot of people land, I think, in their evaluation of Boulez's work, is that I, by far, by a very wide margin, I prefer the early works. And by the early works, I mean everything from the Sonatina for flute and piano up to Éclat multiple. And after that point, it starts to get really difficult for me. Now, I've said this a few times in private conversation with friends, but and I'm not going to start psychoanalyzing Boulez or delving into his biography. There are things that I don't know about him personally, and the public doesn't know, and that are probably none of my business anyway, but something seems to have happened around that time. He certainly shifted a lot more towards conducting, towards this more sort of public role as a figure around that time. So that's a big part of it, obviously. I suspect, and this is just a theory, but I suspect that there was also, this rivalry with Stockhausen that perhaps didn't go the way he wanted it to. You can remember that at the premiere of Gruppen, Boulez's third piano sonata was premiered on the same occasion. And the Boulez, the Stockhausen piece, Gruppen, is this it's this spectacular piece, like one of the great scores of the 20th century. And it's a piece that it sells out the hall every time it's performed now. It's a really, really special thing if you ever get a chance to go hear that piece. It's like 3 orchestras spatialized with all of these incredible effects. It makes an impression on pretty much anyone, even if you can't stand 20th century music, even if all you're interested in is pop music or Mozart or whatever. Like there's something about Gruppen. It has this aura about it. It's a fascinating piece, and it's just like one of the most inventive and imaginative and colorful and amazing things that I think was written around that time. Anyway, so Boulez, in some sense, had the misfortune of having this third piano sonata on which he labored for years. This was clearly a bit of a stumbling block for him. He couldn't quite find the key to finishing this piece for all sorts of reasons. It's not a completely successful work, I don't think. It's quite a problematic one in many respects. Anyway, so the third piano sonata is premiered the same night as Gruppen, in which Boulez himself was conducting. And this little, this piano piece that doesn't quite work, compared to this gigantic orchestral, spectacular fresco of Stockhausen's, it had to have made a pale impression. And I suspect that was a turning point. Again, don't take my word for this. I'm not a historian. This is just based on things I've read and things that conclusions that I've come to independently. But that sort of marks a turning point, I think, where the European avant-garde is starting to look more towards Stockhausen as a kind of a beacon. And I think Boulez sensed that his significance as a composer may have been on the wane. And he also had a number of conspicuous public failures, like the piece Polyphonie X, which was premiered, I believe, at the Donaueschingen Festival and did not go down well at all. It's an interesting piece historically, but from any musical point of view, it's a ridiculous composition in which one of Boulez's signal weaknesses as a composer, unfortunately, was cruelly exposed, which was his lack of experience with orchestration. He wrote impossible things for instruments that he just didn't understand. That was a lacuna that he filled to some degree in the later works, although even in the Notation, even in Plis selon Plis and other pieces, there are some very bizarre things in the orchestration that, in my view, don't really quite come off. He has a very idiosyncratic and not always altogether successful approach to orchestration, in my view. But that's maybe a topic for another day. Anyway, so something happened, around then, and after the mid-'60s, there's this kind of gap. He's still writing pieces, but they're coming a lot less frequently, and he's starting to get on this endless cycle of revision. He'll start a piece, he'll present a kind of a provisional version of it to the public, and then he'll withdraw the score and sit on it for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years and make another version of it and another version and another version. And each time sort of expanding it so that the pieces become longer and longer and longer. Not always to their benefit, by the way. So he would take a piece where the core of the idea might have resulted in a really fantastic 5 to 10 minute piece. And then he'll blow it up to a 20-minute piece, 30-minute piece, 40-minute piece, 45-minute piece. And the thing with the late pieces that I don't get as a musician is he becomes obsessed with sort of exhausting his material. The idea being that it's this sort of hyper-combinatorial idea where it's like, well, here's some chords I've got, and here are some rhythmic ideas, and here's the basic concept of this piece. How can I exhaust this? How can I run through every conceivable combination of these materials until there's nothing left to work with? And the thing is, he would keep finding more and more and more and more ways to multiply his material, and not always, again, to the benefit of the piece. Because the thing that interests me in art is not exhaustivity. It's not, how much can I pull out of this initial little idea? It's selection. It's choice. It's saying, okay, sure, there's 50,000 things I could do with this, but here are the 2 things that really matter. And Boulez in his late works, he gets into this kind of bulimia of sound that I don't understand. I don't connect with it. I don't understand why a perfectly good 15-minute piece has to balloon into a 45-minute piece, as happened with Dérive 2, as happened with Exposante Fixe, as happened with many parts of Plis selon Plis. I don't find the finished versions, in all their grandiosity, to be superior to the original versions, and sometimes more like the contrary. So I have a lot of trouble with these late works, and also with what seems to me to be an increasing artificiality in his language. I don't have another word for it than that. In the early works, which I admire tremendously to this day, there's an incandescence, there's a violence, there's an immediacy of expression, where the materials that he's using are adequate to and perfectly matched to the expressive world of the piece. And then in the later works, for me, there's a kind of strange abstraction that sets in, where again, he's more interested in endlessly multiplying the same material, the same chords, the same harmonic ideas, again and again and again and again. But without there being, in my view, a commensurate expressive dimension. And so I find these late pieces personally quite exhausting to listen to. They don't renew themselves. They just multiply themselves until, you feel like you're in one of those rooms for children, where there's like hundreds of plastic balls that you can dive into, and the room's filling up with more and more and more and more and more of these plastic balls until you're kind of buried in them. I don't know about you, I had a nightmare when I was a kid that I would be in one of those sort of fun rooms. It's supposed to be fun, where you're diving around in the balls, but then like you fall into them and you can't get out, and the room just falls, it just completely fills up with them. And that's how I feel with a lot of those Boulez pieces. It's like I'm being exhausted and sort of falling under this deluge of material without any particular selection being operated upon it. And I don't get why I'm doing that. And I understand that Boulez, because of his experiences conducting very large late Romantic works like the Bruckner symphonies, the Mahler symphonies, the Ring of Wagner, at that point he starts shifting in his compositional concerns and starts, I think, becoming preoccupied with the idea of making sort of a grand public statement and wanting to take the compositional language and the technique that he evolved up to that point and make it serve those interests. But here's the problem. I don't think his compositional language was up to that particular task. I don't think it was suited for it. And the idea that, again, you can just take this rather gray and homogeneous harmonic material, which is what he was working with, in my view, again, in the sort of latter half of his career, and just endlessly multiply it and blow it up and expand it, but without there being a really strong trajectory, because all of these works, weirdly enough, Boulez was very critical of Messiaen. He said Messiaen doesn't compose, he juxtaposes. But that's exactly what Boulez does throughout his career. It works in the early pieces because of the extreme violence of the material. That, like, he uses some sort of quasi-classical forms in some of those early pieces, but the material just rips it to shreds, right? Because these forms can't contain this incredibly eruptive, violent material. But in the later works, it's just, they're these sort of static block-like forms with nothing in particular to animate them, to keep them going. And in Sur Incise in particular, it's like, why am I listening to millions and millions and this constant avalanche of notes that's not going anywhere? So, but that's my experience with the later works. And again, I think that he came to a crisis point at the midpoint of his life and tried to find a way forward. And that, combined with his opportunities as a conductor, an orchestral conductor, and his burgeoning experience with especially late Romantic music, that resulted in a shift of perspective for him. I don't think it quite works, at least for me as a musician. But what I would retain of Boulez are the really great scores. And the great scores are high water marks. And any young man, like any 17 or 18-year-old who can pull off something like the Sonatina, the second piano sonata, the first piano sonata, Le Marteau sans Maître, like, these are, all of those works were completed before he was 30. Like, it's astonishing that he was able to do that in basically a desert, right, at the time. The immediate post-war era in Paris was a complicated time to be a young composer. Look what he managed to do. I find it amazing. So, I'll always be grateful for those works. I'm going to be listening to them for a long time to come. And with the later works, maybe I'll have a change of heart. Maybe I'll come back to them. God knows, there are beautiful parts in Plis non plis. No question. There are sections, like the first 2 minutes of Message Esquisse, I think are outstanding, gorgeous, spectacular, perfect balance, perfect harmony, beautiful textures for 2 minutes. And then when he gets into that toccata thing, that just goes, and then it just goes on and on and on and on and on. If only he'd taken those 2 minutes, or it's the same with the opening of Plis Selon Plis. Again, sensational, beautiful, spectacular. But then he gets onto that toccata thing, that sort of mechanistic, not very interesting. So yeah, so that's my feeling about it. It's like there was something in him. I bet you he wanted to, he wanted to go farther with that. And that reveals his connection with French music, the French music that he deeply loved. But it's like it always had to be balanced with these sort of abstract structural ideas. And I feel like there must have been a kind of a conflict there. Whatever, I'm not going to psychoanalyze Boulez. I think the main thing is to be grateful for the works that I appreciate. I'm sure that for you as the viewer, and again, let me know in the comments where you disagree with me. I'm sure it will be different for everybody. Everyone's going to have a different selection of works that they think are really important. Again, most older composers that I know prefer the late works, so I'm kind of a little bit backwards as far as that goes. But there you go. Now, Boulez, the public figure, was also extremely divisive, obstreperous, and sometimes quite obnoxious. And I think that's not done his legacy any favors, unfortunately. In fact, I think it's durably damaged his reputation, and also it probably negatively affected the public's perception of contemporary music and of contemporary composers. And because he was such a major media presence, that's a little bit harder to forgive, I think. I think he did some real damage there. He was very sectarian. He was very dismissive and insulting of the works of other composers, of other aesthetics other than his own. Some of the pronouncements that he made in his polemical writings, Schoenberg est mort and this kind of thing, some of that, there was probably a necessary degree of exaggeration at that time. And I think he felt attacked and he felt like he had to be on the defensive in order to have his project be respected and not be mocked and derided. And he was trying to sort of claw his way into this music scene and defend his own point of view. I get that. But he did it throughout his career. Even when he was established, he would say very insulting things about major figures. And there's nothing to be gained by going out and saying, Shostakovich was a third-rate composer and so on. And he never gave any particular credence to Sibelius, who was obviously a major figure. He was quite insulting towards Morton Feldman. And look, Feldman is one of the great figures of the 20th century. There's no question. And in fact, if you were to look at what have we retained of the aesthetics of the post-war era, into today, and you would have to conclude that Feldman's music has made a greater impact, I think, certainly on the current generation than Boulez by quite a long shot. Some of the Boulez works, like Structure, for example, I think you would look at now as an interesting reflection of the period, but I don't know that you would necessarily view those as being singular or great works that you would, where there would be something in them that you would want to carry forward or build upon in the present day. I don't think you can really do that with a lot of those pieces. It leads to an aesthetic dead end, in my view. Whereas Feldman, to this day, I believe, opens all kinds of exciting perspectives. So Boulez was very dismissive of and insulting towards Feldman. He called him an amateur, and there's a lot of this kind of rhetoric directed towards figures at that time, and that's really unfortunate. So, with time, maybe some of that will be forgotten, and we'll just, we'll return to the works. I think ultimately that has to be the main thing. And I don't want to rag on Boulez here, because if you take, lots of historic figures, lots of great composers from the past, and look at some of the things that they said or did or thought, and there's ample reason to be offended by them or to say this is outrageous or whatever, but beyond a certain point, it doesn't matter all that much. And now that Boulez is no longer here, I'm hoping that eventually, we'll move away from those more unpleasant aspects of his personality, let's say, and focus on the work that he actually did. And he really did play a crucial role in increasing the standards of performance in the post-war era. And this was a time, again, where nobody was playing Schoenberg, the Second Viennese School, even Bartók. There were many works of Debussy that had not been premiered in the U.S. That were very infrequently heard, even in France at the time. And Boulez, he really had a hand in changing that situation. And he sort of brought the poetry of a lot of the early modern composers to a much, much wider audience. And as far as I'm concerned, hooray for that. That's great. That's amazing that he did that. And he was, again, supportive, very supportive of many people. So there's lots to celebrate on the occasion of Boulez's 100th birthday. I hope that, again, the things about him that may be viewed as less positive, they're real and they shouldn't be swept under the rug. But I would encourage all of you to just return to the pieces. Listen to the music that he wrote. I think that has to be the central cornerstone of his legacy. See what you think. I think that there are so many pieces that still have a lot to speak to us today. And I encourage all of you to engage with his work. I have to conclude once again, I don't think Boulez is widely thought of today as an influential figure. I don't hear many young composers who work with me talking about his work in particular. Sometimes they encounter them, in a seminar, and they might have some questions. But it's like Boulez isn't a figure that younger composers are rallying towards amongst 20th century composers. There are others that I can easily cite that I think have a bigger impact. But this is, to a degree, par for the course. When a major figure dies, there tends to be a dip in interest. Historically, this has happened so many times. And there needs to be a kind of a quiet period, a fallow period, if you like, where, we turn to the emerging figures of the present day, the older major figures who have passed on. We need some time maybe to evaluate them and determine, what are the works that we really want to retain as a culture. And all of that takes time. I'm confident that the really strong works will retain their fascination. And for the rest, we'll have to see. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on Boulez. As you can see, it's a mixed bag. Probably my thoughts will change again in 5 years' time, but that's where I'm at today. So thank you for listening. Let me know in the comments below where you think I've got it wrong. And I look forward to continuing the discussion.